All right, we're ready to begin Lecture 2. This is the Trinitarian Foundations for the Doctrine of the Church. And here we want to focus on this big idea. Here's the big idea for this lecture, and that is the true church reflects the unified relational life of God. True church reflects the unified relational life of God. We talked about last time what counts as church. We also ended with the question, is the church necessary? And I think we can answer those questions by saying, going back to Genesis 1:28, where God creates male, female in his image, gives us the command, the instruction to be fruitful, multiply, to care for the earth, and to have dominion over the earth. And he does that. All of that is to say that he wants us to spread his image over the earth, because when his image is over the earth, he has chosen to have dominion, exercise dominion over the earth through us being in his image. And so we reflect his life. We reflect God, and that is part of the purpose of the church. Now we're going to we're going to, first of all, let me talk a little bit about the image of God. And again, there may be a little bit of change from the outline you have, but this is the most up-to-date outline. I made some adjustments over the weekend. I want to look at the image and community. I want to give some qualification, talk about the mission of the church, and then have you started reading some of John Zizioulas? That's the
No, I will be this
kind
week.
of a,
Yeah,
what's that?
I will be this week.
Okay. All right. So I'll try to get to that to make sure that it'll help you understanding. Zizioulas is a Greek Orthodox theologian, and probably the most widely read Greek Orthodox theologian, at least one of them. And this particular book is one of two works that he has written on the church. And I'm warning you now, it's a pretty dense book. It's a pretty dense book, but we can have discussion. And I don't know, I've read the book half a dozen times. Every time I read it, I get more out of it. Yes.
On those study questions, do they pretty much fall in order as I
Yes.
read?
Yes, they do. Yes,
Okay.
they do. Oops.
Thank you.
Yes, they do. Let's get into the image. First of all, image and community. So the church is a community of persons, right? The communion of the saints. And it is within community that the image of Christ is renewed in us. So as individual believers, we are called to be renewed in the image of Christ. And being renewed in the image of Christ means reflecting something of the relationship of Christ as he relates to the Father and the Son. We too are to be communal beings, persons in communion with others. So Christ is called the image of God in the New Testament, and it is important for us to know that no one can image God alone. We do not image God alone. Although Christ is said to be the image of God, Christ is never alone. So we'll look at some of the basics of Trinitarian theology in a minute. The image of God is reflected in Genesis. The image of God as a community is reflected in Genesis 1:26 and 27, when God said, "Let us make man in our image." And it is true that plural can be a plural of majesty. That is possible, and actually that's probable. When God says, "Let us make man in our image," he is not necessarily making a Trinitarian statement, but he is making a statement about the glory of God, his majesty, and that his majesty is spoken of in the plurality. Now, this is a way of speaking that is common in the ancient Near East, that when you want to emphasize the majesty of something, you put it in the plural. So once again, we have to be careful saying that this is Trinitarian theology, because it's not explicitly so, and yet reading it with Christian lens, we can say that the image of God reflects something of the majesty and plurality of God himself. There's one other textual indicator in Genesis that kind of gives the plurality to it, because the plural in itself, the plural form of "let us make God in our image," would not be enough in itself. But then when he makes man, what does he say? He sees man, he has all the animals, and he says it is not good for man to be alone, right? So God, that's a very important statement in regard to how God exists in himself when he says, "Let us make man in our image," because loneliness for God is outside of his nature. There is no loneness in God. And so when he creates male and female in his image, he does so first creating man, but making this very important theological statement that it is not good, it is not a good thing for man to live alone, in isolation, outside of relationship with the same kind of being that he is. So that's Genesis chapter 2, verse 18. It is not good that man should be alone. So isolation and aloneness is not good. It's not God's design, and it's not who God is. God has he's never been isolated. He's never been alone. He's never been out of relationship. He's never existed outside of a community of divine persons. God is eternal community. So that's the image and community. Let's go to point B. So I want to make a qualification, and this qualification is simply this. In fact, I may have some notes here. This is a quote from John Kilner. He says, equating relationships or relational capacity, if it's an attribute damaged by sin, but equating relationships with being in God's image is reductionistic. It fails to recognize that there is much more to human beings and to being in God's image than relationship, or than relationship alone. Animals, for instance, engage in relationship, as do Satan and demons, unless one brings to bear other considerations such as reason, righteousness, and others. Relationship can be oppressive. Many who incline toward the idea that being in God's image somehow involves relationship have become sensitive to the insufficiency of relationship alone as the essence of what creation in God's image entails. So the qualification is this. The image of God, bearing the image of God, requires relationship. That's Genesis 2:18. It is not good for man to be alone. So the image of God requires relationship, but those relationships themselves do not comprehend the entirety of what counts as the image of God. And that's what John Kilner is saying in his great book, Dignity and Destiny, which is a book on the image of God. And I had the privilege of taking the class from him, from which this book was written. So, God could have settled with creating Adam and leaving Eve uncreated, and that would not have necessarily eliminated the possibility of him creating Adam in his image, but it would have been a deeply flawed image. It would not have been a good image of God, because God said it is not good for man to be alone. So he could have created Adam alone. He could have put something of his image on Adam, but without relationship, it's not a good image. It would be... let me move forward. I think to the next point. I already read the quote from John Kilner. So then now let's talk about the mission of the church, or the mission of the image. Sorry, I should say image. Here we go. So Adam could have reflected the image of God, even relationally, without Eve, because he was in relationship with God. Yet God was not pleased for that to be the only relationship. And so he created another like being, Eve, another human being, in order for Adam to fulfill the mission of the image. So now we're talking not just the reflection of the image, but now why the image on Adam and Eve. And it has to do with God's mission and why he created Adam and Eve in the first place, and what he hopes to accomplish through humanity. So God wants humanity. He wanted humanity to reflect the divine image in our own relationships, as well as our relationship with him. So this is why he created Eve. It was not good for man to be alone, because God's mission for dominion requires the horizontal relationship as well as the vertical relationship between God and man. God's mission for dominion is that the fruitfulness and the subduing and the dominion would take place through man being able to reproduce themselves, reproduce the image of God within their own posterity. And that would be, so that requires the relational aspect between human beings, the creation of Eve. So God creates Eve as the perfect counterpart to Adam, and male and female tell us something about human relationship. It tells us that no human being is complete in themselves, especially as it comes to biology and sexuality and everything that makes us who we are. So he creates Adam as a male, and his design is he's going to create another person who is necessary for Adam to be able to carry out the mission of the image. So Adam cannot carry out the mission by himself. He may be able to reflect the image of God just through a relationship with God, but he cannot fulfill God's mission without being complemented with Eve, male and female. So the creation of male and female tells us something about God's mission and his design and the destiny of human being. So again, there's a qualification. John Kilner writes this. He says, quote, "Being male and female facilitates being God's image. It does not constitute it." So being male or female itself is not the image, because God is neither male nor female. There is no, that's not to say there's no maleness and femaleness in God. God is what we call suprasexual. That means he is above sexual distinction, but whatever of the image of God is reflected in female, and whatever of the image of God is reflected in male is true of God. And of course, we see that through Scripture, the various metaphors that are used for God. Let me point this out also. The fact that the New Testament can affirm that Christ is the image of God also should keep us from saying that the male-female relationship is what constitutes the image. The male-female relationship is necessary for the mission of the image, but they are part of the design for how God is going to enable us to carry out the mission of the image, but they themselves are not the image, or at least all that the image means. All right, I'm going to skip the rest of my notes on that and go on to the next point. And that is the church as the second image. So how does humanity, how do we reflect the image of God? We do so in relationship as well as other ways. So this does not mean that a single person, who's never been married, doesn't mean that they cannot reflect the image of God. They do, even though they're not married. Nonetheless, marriage is the first analogy of the Trinity in Scripture. Marriage is the first analogy. So husbands are to love their wives as Christ loves the church. So there's an analogy there. In the Old Testament, God relates to humanity through the metaphor of marriage. So God makes a covenant with Israel, so that Israel becomes his bride. And of course, Jeremiah and the prophets talk about how the bride became a harlot and became unfaithful to their marriage to God. So marriage is the first analogy of our relationship with God, and reflects something of the communal relationship of God. The second image, though, is the church. The church. That is, that the church as a whole also reflects God, which is why the New Testament can call the church his body, or one of the many other metaphors that are used to describe the church. It is God's design that humans should share with one another something of what God shares within his own personhood. Marriage is the first analogy. The church is the second image. So we reflect, as the church, as the communion of saints, we reflect the renewed image of Christ in man, the renewed image of God in humanity. Maleness and femaleness, essential as they are to what it means to be human, they point to something beyond themselves. So our gender says one thing very clearly, and that is, I am incomplete on my own. Gender identity sends loud and clearly the message that we are created for relationship as ecclesial. That means communal, gathered beings in relationship. That's what ecclesial means. Beings in community. Let's go then to John Zizioulas, who writes a book called Being as Communion, and which you will begin reading. And I want to let me pull the book off the shelf. Yeah. So you'll start reading. Is yours the same color? Yeah. Okay. You'll start reading right off the bat in the introduction. First sentence, right? The church is not simply an institution. So when he says that, what he is already setting up the discussion by saying The church cannot be defined by function alone. So he's going to have some problems with our formulations that are based solely on function. Now, he's going to talk about the sacraments. He has a lot to say about that. So he's not going to deny function as important to the concept of church, because obviously in relationship there is function. So maleness has function, femaleness has function. Members of the body of Christ all have various gifts of the Spirit, and they function differently. So he's not denying that, but right up front he's going to say that's not how we should primarily think of the church. The church is not simply an institution. And he means the church is not simply a function of humanity. It's more than that. She is a mode of existence, a way of being, a way of functioning, a way of... no, let me back up there. I don't want to confuse function with being, because that's not what he means. It is being that is more than function. So go down to the second paragraph. He says, in the first place, ecclesial being is bound to the very being of God. From the fact that a human being is a member of the church, he becomes an image of God. He exists as God himself exists. He takes on God's way of being. This way of being is not a moral attainment, something that man accomplishes, but it is a way of relationship with the world, with other people, and with God, an event that he calls communion. And that is why it cannot be realized as an achievement of an individual, but only as an ecclesial fact. In other words, together. This is something that is accomplished together. So that paragraph, to summarize that paragraph, and that is a summary of the entire book right there. That paragraph is, he is saying God is an ecclesial God. God is essentially a community of holy being. Right? So God is a being. He's a single being, but he is a community of being. And so we, as Christians, are also called to ecclesial being. So this is his way of saying the church reflects the image of God. So there are a couple of words here on the screen, on this PowerPoint slide that you'll want to be aware of. So he's going to describe, I think in this first chapter somewhere, in fact, I think it's part of the study questions, but he's going to describe God's character as ecstatic. Now, you can spell that E-C-S-T-A-T-I-C, but I put it in the Greek form to divide out the, and I don't remember, I think he uses the English, or the translator here spells it in the English form, but ecstatic, that means out of the state, or out of the our status, our being. God's character is ecstatic rather than enstatic. Enstatic is something just exists alone without relationship to anything else. You know, so a rock is a very static being, right? God is a interactive being, so he's ecstatic. That means he is oriented toward others. So the fact that we believe that God is triune, that the Bible reveals God as triune, requires us to affirm that God is others-centered. The Father centers on the Spirit and the Son centers on the Father and the Spirit on the Father and Son. So John Piper, who wrote some of his early works, were two books. One is yes, just forgot it. Well, The Pleasures of God was the second one, and then his book on Christian hedonism. I'm not sure if you've read it or not. Are you familiar with that book on Christian hedonism? Oh, what's the name of that book? Just slipped my mind. Anyway, Desiring God, the book Desiring God. It's a great book. It's become a sort of a modern classic. And in that book, he basically just takes the Westminster Confession that our purpose on earth is to enjoy God forever, and so he tries to recapture this sense of the joy of being a Christian, and it's not just a duty, but it's a delight, and he does a powerful job. But out of that book, and then he wrote another book called The Pleasures of God. How God is pleased for us to glory in Him, to delight in Him. But out of those two books, the major criticism for Piper is that he makes God appear to be an egomaniac, that God is completely self-centered. He is out to get glory for Himself. Because I don't recall in Desiring God, I don't remember Piper even mentioning the Trinity in that book, and this is a major criticism. I've been in a session where Piper was there, and the overwhelming criticism from the other theologians who were there, were you didn't overcome this problem of making God appear to be a very self-centered God. Since then, he's tried to address that, but what's important is that the Father is not self-centered, the Son is not self-centered, the Spirit is not self-centered. They eternally face the other. So when God creates humanity, when He creates the world, and animals and humanity, but particularly humanity, when He creates humanity, He creates us physically to be oriented outward, to be oriented to the other, so that when we interact, a normal human interaction begins with face-to-face, eye contact, that sort of thing. We are created to be centered on others, not to be self-centered. And that's what it means to be ecstatic. And that's what Zizulus is going to describe as the being of God. To be is to be in communion. To exist rightly is to exist as an ecstatic, others-oriented person. This other word, substantia, is a word for like His essence, the essence, the substance of a being, and the substance of divine being is love. You can say holy love, and that's fine. Holy love, unblemished love, and so the nature of God is that He bestows love on others. The persons bestow love on others. So if love were to cease to exist, God would cease to exist. If ecclesial reality ceased to exist, God would not exist. Ecclesiality is essential to human being because it comes from the reality of God. Yeah, we'll have some more discussion about Zizulus as we go along. There's some other places here that are just, man, really, really rich stuff. Do you have any? We need to wrap this up, I guess. Do you have any questions so far? I think next time we'll go to this.
No, this is just really interesting stuff. I like it.
Okay.
I'm trying to scratch notes down just as fast as I can go. And so,
Good.
just be sure that you share the 1 and 2 PowerPoint
Mm-hmm.
with me. That'd be great.
Sure.
And maybe in a separate email. That way I can upload it into my
Okay.
set and stuff. But that, yeah, that's really nice. See, because I don't know if I did not pick this up in GBS, way back 30 years ago, or wasn't an emphasis. My